Hello everyone, Brad from the PDH Pod here with Game 1 of my last Pauper Commander stream of 2023. Before we get to the game, use the buttons below to like and subscribe, and remember to tune in to the PDH Pod podcast every Friday for more Pauper Commander talk. Selesnya Dice Factory, Selesnya Go Wide, Dimir Dungeons, and Orzhov Auras. This game had a little bit of a lot of stuff. There's a fine line between casual and high-powered games, and this one towed that line perfectly. For being rather grindy, this was a relatively quick pod, so let's get right into it by introducing everyone's commanders for the evening. First up, we've got me, your host, Brad Drac V from the PDH Pod, playing Yotian Dissident. It's a 2-mana 1/1 human artificer. It says, whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Going second is Hive Cryptid, and they're playing Queen Allenal of Ruadak. A 3-mana star legendary creature elf noble that says Queen Allenal's power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures you control. If one or more creature tokens would be created under your control, those tokens plus a 1/1 white soldier creature token are created instead. Going third is Abby, the common commander, playing Viconia, Drow Apostate, with the background of Dungeon Delver. Viconia is a 3-mana 2/3 legendary creature elf cleric that says at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard, return a creature card at random from your graveyard to your hand, and choose a background. And Abby has chosen the background of Dungeon Delver, a 2-mana legendary enchantment that says commander creatures you own have room abilities of dungeons you own, trigger an additional time. And in the fourth seat is Dax, and he's running Underworld Coinsmith, a 2-mana 2/2 enchantment creature human cleric with Constellation that says, whenever Underworld Coinsmith or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. And then it has the activated ability of pay a white, a black, and 1 life. Each opponent loses 1 life. All 4 players resolve opening hands and mulligans, and we're off. I draw my first card to start the game, then play a Cabaretti Courtyard. It gains me 1 life, and I fetch a Plains, which comes into play tapped. I pass the turn. Hive draws for their first turn. They play a Tranquil Expanse, and pass. Abby draws for turn and plays an Evolving Wilds. They immediately crack it to go fetch an island into play tapped, and then they pass the turn. Dax draws for turn. He plays the first untapped land of the game with a Plains, but having no turn 1 play though, they pass it back to me. I untap and draw to start turn 2. I play another tapped land, a Path of Ancestry, then tap my Plains to play the first creature of the game, an Arcbound Mouser. Hive untaps and draws, they play a Plains, then tap 2 to play a Poison Dart Frog. They pass the turn after that. Abby untaps and draws for turn, then plays a Swamp to get both of their colors online. Still having no plays, they pass the turn. Dax doesn't need to untap, but he does draw for turn. He also gets both of his commander's colors online by playing a Swamp, then casts said commander, Underworld Coinsmith, which gains Dax 1 life when it enters the battlefield. After that, he passes the turn. I untap my lands and draw for turn. They get both of my colors online by playing a Forest. I cast my commander, Yotian Dissident. I use the mana from Path of Ancestry, so I scry 1 card back to the top of my library. I then tap my Plains to cast a Core Halberd. It's an artifact, so it triggers my commander, and I choose to put a +1/+1 counter on the Mouser. I move to combat. Going clockwise around the table, I swing at Hive for 2. They choose not to block, so they take 2 damage, and I gain 2 life off the Mouser's lifelink. After combat, I pass the turn. Hive untaps and draws. They tap both lands to play their commander, which enters as a 2/2. Hive then plays a Broker's Hideout to gain a life and fetch a Forest into play. They move to end their turn, but at the end step, Abby pays 2 to cycle a Vizier of Tumbling Sands to draw a card. They use the Vizier's ability to untap their Swamp, which they immediately tap to cycle Troll of Khazad-dûm to fetch a basic Swamp into their hand. Hive's turn is officially passed after that. Abby untaps and draws for the turn. They play the recently fetched Swamp, then tap 2 to play Corpse Churn to mill 3, then return a creature card from their graveyard to their hand. They mill a Bojuka Bog, a Tokashia's Dig Site, and an Underdark Explorer, then chooses to put the Troll back in their hand. Wasting no time, Abby cycles the Troll for a second time to fetch another Swamp from their library. They pass the turn after that. Dax untaps and draws for turn. He plays another Plains, then taps out to cast a Grim Guardian, which enters the battlefield and causes Dax opponents to lose a life. It's also an enchantment, so Coinsmith triggers to gain Dax 1 life. They pass the turn to me after that. I untap, then draw for turn. Having no land drop, I tap 3 to play a Commander's Sphere, which triggers my commander, and I put the +1/+1 counter on itself. I then pay 1 to equip the Halberd to the Mouser and move to combat. Keeping true to my battle promises, I swing at Abby with the Mouser. They have nothing to block with, so they take 3 damage and I gain 3 life. Nothing in main phase 2 for me, so I pass the turn to Hive. Hive untaps and draws for turn. They tap both of their basics to cycle a Timberland Ancient to go fetch a forest to hand, which they play as their land drop for turn. Hive moves to combat and swings a super sus 2/2 into my untapped 3/3. Concerned about instant speed combat tricks to grow the queen, I go ahead and declare no blocks. Hive says they have quote-unquote nothing as far as that goes, so I take 2 commander damage. They go ahead and pass the turn after combat. Abby untaps and draws. They play a swamp for turn, then tap out to play a Trailblazer's Torch, which introduces the initiative to the game. They venture into the secret entrance and fetch an island to hand. Having no other plays, Abby passes the turn. Dax untaps and draws for turn, eyeballing that sweet, sweet initiative. He plays another swamp for turn, then pays 2 for a Font of Return. When this enchantment ETBs, Coinsmith triggers to gain Dax 1 life, and the Guardian triggers to cause the rest of the table to lose 1 life. Dax then taps a white to cast Holy Strength, targeting his commander. This aura resolves, and we play another round of the old Gain and Drain. Dax moves to combat and swings the Coinsmith at Abby for 3 damage and for the initiative. He passes the turn and joins Abby in the secret entrance. He fetches a Plains to hand. I untap and draw, now also eyeballing the initiative for myself. I tap 2 for a Selesnya Signet. Dissident triggers again, and I put the +1 counter on my commander. I then tap my remaining mana sources to cast a Tinkerer's Tote. It's an artifact that ETBs and creates 2 1/1 Golem artifact creature tokens. The Dissident triggers thricely, so I distribute 3 +1 counters on the Mouser and 1 on each of my new Golems. I move to combat, swinging just the Mouser at Dax. He declares no blocks and takes 4 damage. I gain 4 life and the initiative. While fetching a forest into play for my land drop for turn, I move to pass the turn to Hive, but on my end step they cast Charge of the Mites to create 2 1/1 Phyrexian Mite artifact creature tokens that can't block and with Toxic 1. These tokens trigger the Queen, and she creates a 1/1 White Soldier creature token. Hive untaps with a now 5/5 commander, then draws for turn. They move straight to combat, and after some negotiating for the initiative, they swing 1 Mite at me, 1 Mite at Abby, and the Queen at Dax. I promised not to block. Abby has no blockers, and Dax chooses not to block, so we all take our damage and or poison counters, and Hive joins the rest of the party in the secret entrance. They fetch and play a Plains for turn, then tap all the way out to cast an Imperial Oath, which creates 3 2/2 Samurai tokens and also triggers the Queen to create another soldier token. The Oath also allows Hive to scry 3. They put 2 back on top and 1 on the bottom, then pass the turn with a 9/9 commander. Abby untaps, draws, then plays an island for turn. They tap 2 to play a Mire Triton, which ETBs and mills Abby for 2. They then cast a Crow of Dark Tidings, which mills for another 2 when it enters the battlefield. With nothing else to do, Abby passes the turn. Dax untaps and draws. He plays the fetched Plains for turn, then taps 2 to cast a Scourge Mark, targeting the Coinsmith. Scourge Mark draws Dax a card when it enters and gives +1/+0 to the enchanted creature. It also triggers both his commander and the Guardian to gain Dax a life and drain us for 1. He then taps 3 mana to cast a Heliod's Pilgrim, allowing Dax to tutor an aura card to hand. He chooses a Lunarch Mantle. Also choosing to skip his combat, he passes the turn. I untap and draw. I play a Thornglint Bridge as my land for turn. It appears that I completely missed that the bridge should have triggered my commander. No surprise there. Anywho, I tap 3 to play a Captured by Legax, targeting Hive's Queen. It resolves, and I support 2 by putting a +1/+1 counter on each of my Golems. I then tap my 3 remaining manas for a third Golem, but this time it's of the Howling variety. It triggers my commander, and I put the counter on the Mouser. I move to combat and swing the 5/5 life-linking Vigilant Mouser at Dax. He throws Heliod's Pilgrim under the bus, and I gain 5 life. After combat, I pass the turn. Hive untaps, draws for turn, and ventures into the Forge. They put 2 +1/+1 counters on a Samurai token. They then tap a Plains to cast Benevolent Bodyguard. It briefly makes the Queen a 10/10 before Hive sacrifices it to give the Queen protection from white, which causes the Captured by Legax to fall off. After that, they tap everything to cast an Angel of the Dawn. Hive's board gets +1/+1 and Vigilance until the end of turn. The Queen is back up to a 10/10, and the rest of the table agrees that this game has just gotten out of hand. Hive moves to combat, sending the 11/11 Queen at me, a 5/5 Samurai, a 3/3 Samurai, and 2 2/2 soldiers at Dax, and 2 2/2 Mites and a 3/3 Samurai at Abby. Abby has combat priority first. They block the Samurai with the Mire Triton, then take 4 damage and 2 more poison counters. Dax lines up 2 blockers, then takes 7 damage. Lastly, I chump block the Queen with a 2/2 Golem. After combat, Hive passes the turn. Abby untaps and draws to start their turn. They play an island, then equip the torch to their crow. They move to combat, swinging the crow at Hive, who chooses not to block, so they take 2 crow damage, and Abby regains the initiative. They also move into the forge and put 2 +1/+1 counters on their only creature. Second main phase, Abby pays 4 to cast a Dread Return, targeting the Underdark Explorer. It ETBs and pushes her further into the Undercity. Abby chooses to goad the Queen, and rightfully so, then passes the turn after that. Dax untaps and draws. He plays a Swamp for turn, then pays 2 to cast Lunarch Mantle, targeting the Coinsmith. When the Mantle ETBs, Dax gains a life and the rest of the table loses 1 life. He then casts an Ethereal Armor, also targeting his commander, which also does a bit of the old gain and drain. In light of these recent events, Abby regrets goading the Queen. Dax continues the Aura Onslaught by casting Benevolent Blessing, targeting the Coinsmith, and starts another round of life gain and life drain. Dax chooses to give his commander protection from white. He then moves to combat, swinging the Guardian over at Abby and his commander at Hive. Abby chooses not to block, and Hive can't block, so they both take their respective amounts of damage. Dax gains the initiative, choosing to scry 2 before prophesizing his incoming annihilation. He passes the turn. I untap and draw for turn. I tap 4 mana and get the table's attention by casting a Brass Knuckles. It ETBs with a copy of itself, so I put both +1/+1 counters from my commander onto the Mouser. I then spend 1 to equip the Mouser with the original Brass Knuckles. I move to combat and send both the Mouser and the Howling Golem at Dax. Howling Golem triggers and the table draws a card. Dax has no blockers, so he takes 16 total damage, and I gain 14 life off the double striking lifelinker. Second main phase, I pay 2 for an Arcane Signet, then put another +1/+1 counter onto my untapped Golem. Remembering about the initiative trigger, I join Dax in the scrying room. Both cards are terrible, so they get shipped to the bottom of my library. After that, I pass the turn to Hive. They untap and draw for turn, then play a Forest, and then pay 6 for an Alabaster Host Intercessor. It ETBs to exile a creature, and Hive targets my completely innocent and non-threatening Mouser. In response to this trigger, I tap the Signet for a green to cast Tamiyo's Safekeeping to protect my boy. Alabaster's ability fizzles and Hive moves to combat, making Dax's Death Prophecy a reality by sending the Queen in his direction. Hive also swings the Angel at me. We take our damage, Dax is eliminated, and Hive regains the initiative, moving into the arena to goad Abby's Crow. Abby untaps and draws for turn. They play an island, then move directly to combat. They have to swing the Crow at me, but they also send the Explorer my direction as well. I declare 0 blockers and take 9 total damage. Second main phase, Abby pays 4 to cast a Carrion Grub. It ETBs and mills Abby for 4 cards, and becomes a 6/5. They then pay 2 to cast a Fate's Reversal, which returns Twisted Abomination to their hand and ventures them further into the Undercity. They choose to make a 4/1 skeleton token with Menace. Abby passes the turn after that. I untap and draw for turn. Choosing not to play anything in main phase 1, I move directly to combat, sending the Mouser at Hive and the Howling Golem at Abby. Howling Golem triggers and everyone draws a card. Abby blocks the Golem with the Grub, and Hive chump blocks the Mouser with a Soldier token. Before damage, I respond to blocks by paying 1 for a Gaia's Gift, targeting the Mouser to give it another +1/+1 counter, reach, indestructible, and trample until the end of turn. In response to this, Hive declares that they are not just dead, but very dead. I only gain life from the first strike damage, so I go up to 43, and I regain the initiative. Having nothing to goad, I make a treasure token, which is an artifact, so my commander triggers and I put the +1/+1 counter on itself. Second main phase, I pay 4 to cast a Bottle of Gnomes, which is also an artifact, so I choose to put the +1 counter on the Gnomes. I then play a Darksteel Citadel as my land for turn, which is, you guessed it, another artifact, so I put yet another counter on the Gnomes. With no more cards in hand, I move to pass the turn, but Abby has other plans. At EOT, they cycle the Abomination. Abby untaps and draws to start her turn. After playing a Swamp, they pay 5 total mana to cast their commander, Viconia, and the Dungeon Delver background. With double dungeon triggers online, Abby moves to combat and swings the basically unblockable Flying Crow at me for 2 damage, and she gets the Throne of the Dead 3 trigger twice. Throne 1, Abby reveals the top 10 of their library, choosing to put Mindrack Harpy into play with 3 +1/+1 counters and hexproof until their next turn. The second Throne trigger happens, and Abby takes no time in choosing to put Archaeomancer into play with all the good stuff on it. When in ETBs, Abby returns Resculpt to their hand. I'm in danger. Second main phase, Abby casts a Runaway Together, targeting my Mouser and the Underdark Explorer. Did I mention that I'm in danger? After that impactful turn, Abby passes. Fearing the end is nigh, I untap and draw for turn. I replay the Arcbound Mouser and put the extra +1/+1 counter on it. Desperately needing some gas in the tank, I float a white mana with Commander's Sphere, then sacrifice it to draw a card. I play a Hidden Courtyard for turn, then tap 2 to equip the Core Halberd to the Bottle Golems. Then paying another 2, I put both Brass Knuckles onto the Mouser. Having 0 good attacks and being hellbent once again, I go ahead and pass the turn. Abby untaps to start the turn. During her upkeep, Viconia triggers to put a random creature from Abby's graveyard into their hand. The Dice Gods decide that Snooping Newsy is the correct choice. Abby then draws for turn. Having the initiative, she also restarts the Undercity to fetch a couple of swamps to hand. To start main phase 1, Abby casts the Newsy, which ETBs and mills her for 2 cards. It also becomes a 3/3 with lifelink thanks to its static ability. Abby moves to combat and the Harpy triggers to mill each of us for 3 cards. She sends both of her flying creatures at me for a total of 10 damage. I have no blockers and no cards in hand, so the damage is taken. Second main phase, Abby taps 5 to recast Underdark Explorer, which ETBs and lets Abby venture even further into the Undercity. They choose to double trigger the Forge to put a total of 4 +1/+1 counters on the Newsy. They pass the turn after that. I untap and draw for turn. I then tap 2 mana to play a Sky Skiff. On ETB, it triggers my commander and I put the +1 counter onto the Mouser. After that, I spend 5 mana to spin the Discover Wheel with the Courtyard. The first card off the top of my library is Chromatic Star, which isn't great. I go ahead and cast it for free and put the +1 counter from my commander's ability onto the Bottle Gnomes. I then use said floating mana to play a Sunbeam Spellbomb, and I put the counter from the Dissident onto the Dissident. In an act of vile desperation, I crack my treasure token to activate the Signet and use the white mana from it to crack the Spellbomb to draw another card. I have never dug so hard for answers in my life, I tell you what. With 1 green mana floating, I cannot cast the card I drew, and terrified of swinging into Abby's board, I go ahead and pass the turn. Abby untaps and draws for turn, the Undercity triggers, and Abby chooses to double trap my face for a total of 10 losses of life. She then taps 2 to cast Resculpt, targeting my Sky Skiff, and my downfall has begun. The Sky Skiff is exiled, and I get a 4/4 elemental creature token. It's at this point that Abby realizes she forgot Viconia's upkeep trigger, but she chooses to skip it because we didn't really think it mattered at this point. Abby then taps a total of 5 mana to cast and equip Whisper Silk Cloak to the Newsy. Knowing that I have no way to deal with double-digit flying damage and 7 power worth of unblockable lifelinking damage, we both come to an agreement that I'm just dead, and that is GG's. Congrats on the win, Abby, and thanks for showing us that you don't have to play Rilsa to have a sweet Dimir Dungeons deck. Thanks for watching until the end of the video, everybody. Check the links in the description below, and now go play some PDH. Peace!